Our first speaker for this session is Dr. Doron Bauer. He is an assistant professor of medieval and Islamic art history at Florida State University. He is the author of Romanesque Sculpture Towards an Anti-Iconography and another monograph, Art in the Kingdom of Majorca, an anthology of sources. He is a recipient of numerous awards. Among them are the Chateaubriand Fellowship. I always thought that's only a Franklin Research Grant, a Max Planck Society Postdoctoral Fellowship, and a Gerda Henkel Foundation Research Grant. In the upcoming fall semester, Dr. Bauer will work at the first Center for Spain in America. He will be a fellow in residence there at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute on Cities Upon Cities, the Reconquista and the Colonization of the Aesthetic, a book that examines the Occidentalization, Christianization of Islamic cities in Iberia and Africa after the Christian conquest, as manifested in changes to the city's public monuments, private spaces, urban fabric, and material culture. The title of Dr. Bauer's talk today is Architecture of Conversion, Conversion of Architecture in the Wake of the Reconquista.
Okay, thank you very much, Uriel. What makes a city Islamic or Christian? The question becomes even more challenging once the subject matter is newly conquered Islamic cities in medieval Iberia and Africa, and the aspect we are looking at is the aesthetic rather than the whole cultural or political gamut. My paper aims at asking whether it was necessary to modify the aesthetic fabric of conquered Islamic city in order to convert it to become Occidental and Christian, or was it possible for a city to remain Islamic in its urban and architectural style, yet to be Christian in some other respects? It is a question concerned with the relation between aesthetics and identity in multi-faith and interconnected societies. It may seem easy to answer the question I am posing, since all cities conquered in Iberia are not defined today as Islamic, and hence they have been fully embraced by and integrated into, also aesthetically, the Christian West. It is true that some cities, such as Córdoba, Seville, and Granada, still contain significant remains of Andalusi monuments. Yet, these cities are not referred to as Islamic cities. They are in Spain, in Europe, with all the associations and connotations that these designations conjure nowadays. Nevertheless, as I hope to demonstrate, if we look at a single moment in the evolving life of a city, even if it is the present, we miss the point. A conquest lures us to focus on brief events or in a few decades at most. We designate a conquest of a city with a date. However, instead of telescoping a conquest into events, it is better to think of it as an unfolding process that continuously shapes and negotiates group identities, and with them the memory of the past and its material remains. In other words, the conquest, its construction and aftermath, affects attitudes towards Islamic heritage from the Middle Ages to the present day. Similarly, the conversion of a city is an open-ended process that may experience accelerations and setbacks, if not reversals. In Iberia, the term Reconquista itself justifies such a view of conversion, as it acknowledges the fact that the majority of Islamic cities in the peninsula were formerly Christian and therefore can and should be reconquered and or reconverted. Conversion embodies the potential for deconversion, and the dialectical tensions thus produced mobilizes an ongoing process where the construction of the aesthetic as an identity-making component is always negotiated. What was then the nature of this negotiation? In the rest of the paper, I give several different examples for the modalities of and the motivations for conversion of architecture and the colonization of the aesthetic in conquered or reconquered Islamic cities in Iberia and Africa. Most often, the conversion of a conquered Islamic city was set into motion by means of performances. 2 days after the Portuguese took Ceuta in August 21st, 1415, King João I declared that he wants to celebrate the next Sunday Mass in the Great Mosque. The Mass was preceded by the following purification and consecration liturgy to convert the mosque into a church. The priest began his exorcism with salt and water. saying over it a prayer which is said in the Holy Mother Church with the following words: Almighty God, we piously ask you that with your infinite mercy you will bless and sanctify this salt, which by your holy grace you have given for the health and benefit of the human race. The same was done with water, which was in a silver cauldron, and meanwhile the priest sang an antiphon with the words, "The Lord's house is built on the highest mountains, to which all people come, singing, Glory be to you, our Lord." When this ceremony ended, they took the curtains and began to arrange them, and they set an altar in place. Soon after the Mass ended, the king staged a ceremony of a different kind in the former mosque when he knighted his 3 sons. The infantes withdrew to their apartments and armed themselves, and in this manner they came together to the church, which was a splendid thing to see, for they were all large and well-formed and were dressed in clean and decorated harnesses and were wearing their swords, which had been blessed, and by their sides and their coat of arms. Before them went trumpeters and shawms, and it was a sight that no one could see without great pleasure. When they came before the king, first the Infante Don Duarte fell to his knees, and drawing his sword from the scabbard, kissed it and gave it to him, and from the hand of his father he was made a knight, and his brothers did the same. The liturgical performances and the spectacle of knighting aimed, among other things, to transform the most important public monument in the city, the Great Mosque, and by metonymy, the city as a whole, into Christian and Portuguese domain. We find these kind of performances in every newly conquered Islamic city. They are a necessary and sufficient condition for the city departure from its Islamic past. In contrast, not in all cities, the urban, architectural, and aesthetic fabrics were modified immediately after the conquest. In places like Saragossa, the Great Mosque, symbolically the most important public building in an Islamic city, underwent significant changes relatively quickly. Soon after Saragossa was conquered by Alfonso I in 1118, a typical 3-nave Romanesque stone church was transplanted into the mosque, producing a hybrid structure. Motivations for the quick building campaign could have been the importance of Saragossa, which became the capital of Aragon and the crowning venue for its kings, and in other places, לא שומעים?
אם אתה יכול טיפה יותר
למיקרופון.
Okay. And as in other places, the need to adjust the orientation of the mosque, which faced Mecca to the southeast. Later in the 14th century, with the declaration of Saragossa as a metropolitan see, the compound was largely replaced by a Gothic building. Interestingly, towards the end of the building campaign, Archbishop Lope Fernandez de Luna built his funerary chapel, nicknamed La Parroquieta, in a mudéjar style, employing Aragonese masters and Sevillian alarifes. The outward wall of the chapel is decorated with sepkas and colored glaze tiles in a manner reminiscent of Andalusi art. This return of the Islamic style to the Cathedral of Aragon's capital, more than 250 years after it has been repressed shortly after the conquest, raises questions. Was it important in the precarious state following the capture of the city to make a political statement by substituting the style associated with the local population with a clearly foreign and Christian style in the figure of the Romanesque? And 2.5 centuries later, once Muslims did not pose a threat anymore in northern Aragon, was it safe to appropriate a style that to us looked Islamic, but perhaps in Saragossa of the 14th century was already void of any cultural, religious, and political association? Moreover, according to the German Renaissance humanist Hieronymus Munzer, who traveled in the Iberian Peninsula between 1494 and 1495, the famous white marble mihrab in the former mosque, attributed to no other than Hanash Abdallah As-Sanani, a disciple of one of the Prophet's companions, was preserved within the chapel. The inconsistent attitude toward Islamic styles in Saragossa betrays the fluidity characteristic of the colonization of the aesthetic, which always leaves a backdoor open for the return of the repressed. And therefore, it is a conversion that is never finite. existing a continuous tension produced by the possibility of reversals. Huesca was conquered on November 26, 1096, and 16 days later, on December 12, the Great Mosque was consecrated as a church. The original building underwent relatively little modifications and remained standing while functioning as a cathedral for more than 2 centuries. However, in 1273, King James I ordered the mosque cathedral to be demolished and to be built on its stead a new building. And this is the original document that the king sent to the bishop of Huesca. Interestingly, in the late 13th century, the Islamic origin of the building was not forgotten or denied. So we have the word mezquita here. So the king remembered that this was a mosque, and no attempt to deny the history of the place itself. And moreover, for James I, it was more fitting to have a cathedral built in a Christian manner, or more Cristiano. If you can see, you can find someone somewhere here. So he wants a new building in a different style that is clearly Christian. The king's discontent with the former mosque testified to the fact that, at least for him, architecture was iconic, an emblem of identity. This view of architecture suits well James I the Conqueror, because it was he who expanded significantly the kingdom, an expansion that resulted in the need to assimilate a large number of Muslims. In this victorious yet unstable moment, the necessity to consolidate the new and old territories endowed architecture with pregnant symbolism. However, often it was not the symbolic meaning of architecture that triggered somewhat indirectly the modification and elimination of Islamic architecture, but rather various non-architectural cultural practices. This was true even in the case of James I, to whom, as we saw, architectural style was an index of faith. Once this king of Aragon conquered Murcia, the leaders of the Muslim population asked him to retain the Great Mosque. James I, who resided in the Alcazar near the mosque, refused by providing the following excuse: that the muezzin should proclaim the Sabbath or the name of Allah close to my head when I'm sleeping, or where I'm sleeping, may seem to you a fit thing, but is not one of my liking. The Christians appropriated the Great Mosque and transformed it into a cathedral, allegedly to maintain the sleeping quality of their king. Purity and cleanliness were a common motivation to capture and transform Islamic buildings. When Fernando I restored the Palencian See in 1059, after more than 300 years, he stated that the city was marked only by bird droppings and Moorish pollution. And in the consecration charter of the main mosque of Huesca, mentioned before, we find the following. And I think the key word here is this kind of expression, which means Muhammadan filth or dung. And similarly, in the consecration charter of the Mosque of Cordoba from the 13th century, we find Spocicia Mahumeti and Expulsa Mahumeti Superstizioni vel Spocicia. So again, this kind of Muhammadan filth or dung. Few centuries later, in the 15th century, when the Portuguese captured Ceuta, they set immediately to clean the floor of the mosque before converting it into a cathedral. For although the floor was very well tiled, it was covered with a great deal of filth. And this was because of the large number of old and rotten mats which were laid there by the Moors, who placed themselves on the ground when saying their prayers, and go without their shoes, and so put the mats there because of the cold. And it seems that when the first mat that has been placed there become rotten, they do not trouble to remove it, but throw others on top of it. And they continue to do this until such times as the first mats are gone and the others are destroyed and turned into filth. For this reason, they, the Christians, threw all the filth outside. After this, the whole building was cleaned very thoroughly. In the case of Ceuta, the rationale for cleaning was not the spiritual, metaphorical impurity that was associated earlier with Islamic buildings, but simply a technical and physical consideration derived from new concepts of hygiene. The Portuguese found certain aspects of the mosque to be dirty. However, this fault did not take the building as haunted by demons and filled with Muhammadan filth as before. In fact, many Christian authors of the 15th and 16th century wrote with admiration on the aesthetic qualities of mosques. And here we have an example by, again, Doron Bauer, who tells us that the old mosque of Almeria was very, very beautiful. And also in the previous slide, I mean, there's some sort of admiration of the floor. I mean, despite the fact that it's dirty. The new concept of hygiene went hand in hand with efforts to regularize geometrically conquered Islamic cities. Portuguese urbanism in North Africa displayed a propensity for quadrangular forms and an urgency to rationalize the curved boundary walls of the Islamic Medina. The dense kasbahs with their narrow sinuous streets and dead-end alleys troubled the European because of both aesthetic and safety considerations. The inherited urban model was thus rejected, and with it the paradigm of privacy and intimacy that characterized the traditional Mediterranean urban morphology under Islamic influence. That now was slowly replaced by the public expression of identity by means of facades inherent to European culture. In Brown's Civitates Orbis Terrarum, the representation of 16th century Ceuta shows the former Great Mosque, now cathedral, marked by the label Templum Summum. And this is this building right here. So we're going to look at the detail. The building still retains its Islamic features with the hypostyle plan, the shingled parallel aisles, and even the minaret. However, the courtyard, a traditional element of great mosques in the Western Islamic lands, was removed so that now the facade faces a large new plaza. Similar processes took place in Granada. As Enriquez de Jorquera wrote, the Alcazaba and the Albaicin had many streets that it was impossible to enumerate them, some with an exit, others without. To broaden the streets and enlarge the houses, urbanism in post-conquest Granada was characterized by the aggregation of small-scale structures. For example, once the Khatabin Mosque was converted into the Church of St. Gil, the modified building absorbed the neighboring streets and the adjacent small shops. Some were transformed into chapels. In both Granada and Portuguese North Africa, urbanism then was employed as a powerful instrument of aesthetic conversion and cultural affirmation. And here you can see the plan of the mosque. This is the street, and we have shops, and the church simply kind of swallowed the street and the shops. Some of them were turned into chapels. This is very characteristic of urbanization in Granada after the conquest. Aside from mosques, Islamic palaces were modified as well, often to suit Christian Occidental Aeolic practices. The Patio del Crucero and the Alcázar of Seville was greatly transformed by Alfonso X. To the garden, the king added an elevated cross-shaped passageway, as well as two relatively wide Gothic galleries, which replaced the narrow Islamic porticos. The new galleries were better equipped to accommodate Castilian court culture. Intentional intervention in Islamic architecture and urban fabric were complemented by passive dilapidation. The Great Mosque of Granada was partially destroyed several years after the conquest. However, a significant part of the building was preserved and incorporated into the newly built cathedral. Only in the 17th century, this old and poorly constructed part was finally demolished after gradually falling into decay. And this is the former mosque that was kind of incorporated into the cathedral, and this part was remained until the 17th century, but then was dismantled. If you would like to understand the full extent and complexity of the colonization of the aesthetic in a conquered city, then observing architecture alone might prove to be insufficient. As Elena Paulino and I have demonstrated elsewhere, few decades after the conquest of Palma de Majorca, the independent Majorcan kings nurtured a particular flavor of the Gothic that is clean, restrained, serene, mathematical, and rational, a style that stands in sharp contrast to the decorative exuberance offered by the then contemporary Islamic and Mudéjar styles. Belvedere Castle, that you see here, is a paragon. However, the silent and empty remains of such public buildings are misleading. A closer look at the archival evidence, for example domestic inventories, demonstrate that Islam and the Islamicate lingered in the island in the form of the arrival of new Muslim artisans and a continuous import of Islamicate objects, for example Islamic and textiles. And you can see also an inkwell here from Alexandria that is mentioned in the inventories. In Palma De Majorca, we find then a hierarchical aesthetic system having two axes. The first axis consisted of the superimposed Gothic and pertained first and foremost to architecture, to containers that shape and define space, and therefore it was static, vertical, monumental, public, and official. The second axis consisted of portable and less durable Islamicate objects that circulated in these Gothic halls. Objects that were, for the most part, were domestic, private, and secular. This vertical superimposition of the Christian and European, complemented by the horizontal flow of subjective and the foreign, provides a more nuanced model of the conversion of material culture. The diverse techniques of conversion of Islamic cities demonstrate the lack of coherent policy towards the material fabric of the city. Nevertheless, in all cities, the conquest initiated a non-theological, dynamic, and continuous process employing intermittently different techniques of conversion and deconversion. The case of Palma de Majorca is particularly interesting. In general, Mallorquins are intellectually aware of, acknowledge, and do not resent the historical presence of Muslims on the island. However, unlike the cities of Andalusia, for example, the Islamicate, or Mudéjar are not parts of their cultural identity. Similar to Claudio Sanchez Albornoz' famous argument regarding the purity of Spanish identity and its resistance to Islamic and Jewish influences, the Mallorquins nurture a puristic self-image which historically has been first and foremost Catalan and Christian. Projecting their own modern identity into the past, the Catalan conquest of 1229 marks for them a decisive moment of conversion and a total break with the Islamic period. However, through the interstices of the collective memory and the material evidence, it is possible to see that Islam and the Islamicate have been continuously negotiated in Majorca up to the present day. The gate of Santa Margarita, originally one of the main gates of the Islamic city, Medina Majorca, survived up to the 20th century, partially because it served as a triumphal monument commemorating the entry of the Christian army to the city, which was thought to take place through the gate. In the first years of the previous century, a heated debate followed between those who were in favor and those who were against the preservation of the gate, which led to the declaration of the gate as a national monument by King Alfonso XIII in 1908. However, 3.5 years later, in the midst of the night of February 26, 1912, an organized group of unidentified workers mysteriously showed up at the gate and blew it with dynamite. Suspicion rose that the Ayuntamiento is behind the demolition, the same Ayuntamiento that previously approved the conservation. But until today, nobody knows really who did this. Moreover, surviving Islamic monuments are currently presented in Majorca in an ambiguous manner. The little-known and little-studied wooden ceiling of the Alfabia, originally an Islamic villa and garden to the north of Palma, is possibly the best preserved of its kind. Two sets of panels below the ceiling present inconsistent information. The white panels inform the visitor that the ceiling is Islamic and dates to 1170. You can see it right here, so it's Al-Mukhad. While the green one states that it is a Mudéjar work from the Christian period, either the 13th or the 14th century. One of the main exhibits in the Alfabia is a massive 15th century oak armchair. Curiously, in old inventories of the estate, it was itemized as the Moorish king's chair, despite the fact that it is clearly a work imported from Flanders, on which the story of Christian and Isolde was carved. These examples demonstrate that regardless of physical transformation and factual givens, the conversion of a city, its association or disassociation with the foreign past, is largely a matter of perceptions and imaginary constructions. As such, and due to the mutability of perceptions, from a broad chronological outlook, that which has been repressed during the conversion can never be fully eliminated. It lurks in the shadow of the historical memory, awaiting an opportunity to return and serve contemporary interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doron. We're moving to our second speaker, Dr. Ihediwa Nkemjika Chimee, teaches in the Department of History and International Studies at the University of Nigeria, Soka, Nigeria, His research interest areas include political history, conflict and genocide studies, environment, science and technology history, as well as social and cultural studies. He has published in reputable journals within and outside Nigeria and has appreciable book chapter contributions. He has attended conferences in Europe, Israel, Asia, and Africa. The title of his talk today is Economic Security, Status Negotiation, and Political Opportunity as Correlates in Explaining the Politics of Conversion to Islam in the Northern Region and Northern Igboland of Nigeria.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry that I couldn't, I wouldn't really know what happened to my system and my flash drives. The maps I had, I could only, be able to salvage only one, and that's this one. Yeah, the story of history, the story of Islam in Nigeria is a story that is over 900 years old. The location of Nigeria. Can you move or use the microphone?
Is it a problem of hearing? Yeah.
Yeah. The story of Islam in Nigeria, is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah. The story of Islam in Nigeria is over 900 years old. Looking at the records of documentations of Islamic scholars in the northern part of Nigeria. Looking at the map of Nigeria, you discover that Nigeria is not homogeneous in any sense, and is a country that has over 450 ethnic nationalities who were just brought together under one national identity and name, Nigeria, in 1914. Prior to the British conquest of the disparate groups that made up Nigeria, Islam and the Islamic Caliphate had been established by the Fulani aristocrats in the northern part of Nigeria. And looking at the map, you just have that up is northern part of Nigeria. And by 1804, the Jihad of Uthman and Fodio unfolded, which saw the liquidation of the traditional Habe Hausa rulers of the north. The Fulanis were originally not indigenous to Nigeria in any sense. They were migrants who came from the Senegambian region. And over the years, being ignorant and scholarly in their traditions of Islamic Brotherhood, they were able to migrate and circulate in the West African sub-region and made their push towards northern Nigeria. The original rulers of northern Nigeria were the Hausas, and the names of their chiefs or kings had been known as the Habes. So by 10th century AD, between 10th and 11th century, the Habe rulers had reasons to be in touch with North African merchants, particularly Berbers, who came to northern Hausa land to trade on horses, horse skins, hides, and other commodities. and they were played host to by the Habe rulers. Over time, Islamic religion began to manifest itself in that part of the country. And by 17th century, a couple of Habe rulers in the north had voluntarily, accepted Islam. But because their acceptance of Islam was a personal choice, it was not their state and official religion. So Islamic practices coincided or cohabited with traditional practices. So when the Fulani preachers, particularly Mandalfodio, was recruited to become the royal teacher of one of the kings of Gobe in Hausaland, he began to teach and preach, the undiluted Islamic principles and precepts to the court. And over time, he became popular and vocal at the same time too. His popularity and vocality became a source of apprehension to the Habe rulers. Series of incidents occurred that led to the expulsion of the sheikh from Gobe. And it was the expulsion of the sheikh based on his criticisms of the practice of Islam and the idolatrous aspect of the traditional religions of the Habe rulers, that gathered, followers around the sheikh. Particularly, he criticized the practice of Jangali, which was a kind of tax levied on cattle headers and horse traders and farmers. And the sheikh was not in support of the Jangali because most cattle rearers in the north were migrant Fulanis, his kith and kin members. So it was these cattle rearers and herders who rallied around behind the sheikh in support of a jihad against the Habe rulers. By 1804, the jihad was declared. And between 1804 and 1810, almost all the Habe rulers in the north, from Zamfara, Gobe, Kebbi, Katsina, were all overthrown. And the sheikh, in declaring the jihad, issued a flag of authority to his lieutenants, who went in all these states to plant the flag. So when you look at the ethnicity of the jihad, you find that it was a jihad, appropriated by a certain ethnicity and executed by a certain ethnicity, using religion as the focal point and then gathering supporters based on a concept that appealed to the audience. Tax and expropriations from the farms by the Habe rulers. So the Hausas who joined the jihad did not understand the underlying dynamics that the Fulanis had in mind. So after the execution of the jihad, all the emirs that emerged in Hausaland were all Fulani. No Hausa became an emir or a district head. So it was an ethnic kind of coup that institutionalized a particular ethnicity in authority, using Islam as a catchphrase. So a caliphate was established. The Sokoto Caliphate became a Fulani Caliphate that was responsible for the administration in matters of Islamic practices, in everyday administration of the Caliphate, up until the arrival of the British by 1900. Though prior to this stage, Borno in the northeast was already an Islamic state before the conquest of the Fulanis. And the ethnic component of Borno as an Islamic state was Kanuri, not Fulani. So when the Fulanis attempted to conquer Borno, it produced a backlash, because the Sheikh of Borno was also a formidable fighter who had, who had been in power over 400 years before the Islamic revivalism of the Fulanis in the corner areas. So the fight between Borno and Sokoto, ended in stalemate, and the Fulanis retreated from there. Now, when the British came, what the British conquest in 1901-02 succeeded in doing was to put a hold on the expansion of Islamic, revivalism and conquest down to the central parts of Nigeria and other parts of Nigeria. The southern part of Nigeria, the Yoruba area, was not conquered. The central area up to all this point, all this area down to the east and south, we are not all conquered. All these areas were not conquered as a result of the intervention of the British. So when the British came, the Sokoto Caliphate ceased in being in charge of the day-to-day administration of the entire area. So between 1900 and 1914, when Nigeria eventually was amalgamated into a British colony, the authorities of the emirs and traditional institutions became exercised as an indirect authority kind of system, where these rulers became employees of the British in day-to-day administration. So the Sokoto Caliphate lost absolute authority of the territory. They became warrant chiefs in the employ of the British. Now, with respect to the expansion of Islam, the wars of conquest ceased, as I said earlier, on the intervention of the British. And then there was nothing like fighting for conversion or fighting for territorial authority in the minority areas in central Nigeria and in any other part of Nigeria. From 1950, when colonial policies began to unravel and when Nigeria was divided into 3 regions, the northern region became the largest region of all the regions in Nigeria. That is, from here, from this intersection became the north up. From this whole area became the south. From this whole area became the southeast. The regional administration that was set up by the British was given authority by the 1946 Constitution to develop regional administrative policies for day-to-day running of the region. Now, the power structure in Nigeria by this Constitution, took on a dimension. The regional powers in the north went into the hands of the Fulani aristocrats. In the south, went into the Yoruba aristocrats, who were also the dominant ethnicity in the whole of southern Nigeria. In the southeast, it fell into the hands of the Igbo, who were also the dominant ethnicity in the region. So, with other minorities coming under them, these major ethnic groups began to struggle for power at the center. The regional government in the north, whose interest over time has been the expansion of Islam and the domination of every other Nigerian, by Sharia, did not waste time in implementing policies that will ensure that conversion to Islam was covertly done through political process, not by jihad again. First was that the regional government in the north, in the 1950s, developed what they call the northernization policy, which was targeted at, excluding all other Nigerians who were resident in the north, who were not Muslims, from the public services of the northern region. It was a policy designed in such a way that if you have been employed in the north and you are not a Muslim and you are not an Hausa or a Fulani, because these are the two conjoined, strong ethnic bloc that waste power in the region, you will be forced to either leave the north, go back to your zone, or stay in the north, lose your job, and also become destitute. The option you have is to either convert to Islam or you quit the north. So that was the first policy. It was an introduction of conversion by default. So when that policy was introduced, over 2,800 Southerners in 1 week lost their jobs in the north. Then for the minorities in the north who were not conquered by the jihadists and who had refused to convert even at the pen of death, they thought that the northernization project was also going to save them from marginalization. So quickly the northern leaders began to develop further policies to exclude the minorities who had been recalcitrant to Islam and conversion from the public, economic and political and social spaces in the north. So what the policy achieved was to force minorities in the north who wouldn't want to lose their job to convert to Islam. First, conversion was in two types. They first of all renounced their political affiliation, because then it was a regional kind of government with political parties contesting for space. But meanwhile, the Northern People's Congress was the major political party that held power in the north, and one of the parties that eventually entered into coalition to produce the independence government of Nigeria. So other minority parties like Northern People's Congress, United People Middle Belt Congress, UMBC, and NEP, Northern People's Progressive Union, appealed to minority groups in the region and were being supported by these minority groups. So first of all, if you're threatening to lose your job as a minority in the north, you renounce your party affiliation, join Northern People's Congress, you're saved at the first stage because you're now a current member of the Northern ruling party. And then the second appeal will be to convert to Islam, to be able to get higher promotions in the public service. When this policy began to unfold, Southerners, lost their jobs. Some Southerners from Yoruba-speaking areas and the Jos-speaking areas and even Igbo-speaking areas who were resident in the north secretly converted to Islam, particularly their businessmen, because they needed a contract. They were the contractors to the regional government then, with the Lebanese who were also, found in the region a lot. So these converts would become Muslims in the north, and they become Christians in the south when they return home. So when you confront them, the idea was to survive, because they knew that without, conversion, that they had no place. And the northernization project was done in such a way that you could not survive it if you are there. For you to make tender for contract, you must produce your local government identification, district head approval, that's traditional institution approval. You must produce evidence of your political affiliation, and then you'll be investigated. And it was done in strict compliance with the rules designed by the regional parliament in the north. So the northernization policy became a policy for subtle conversion to Islam by the minorities who were not originally Muslims. with the passage of time, the political contestation in the north and in the larger Nigeria became very acute. That what the regional government in the north did in order to ensure that the minorities were put on check was to remove institutional heads at the local level in the minority areas that were not subservient to the rules of the ruling party, and replacing them with people from the north and other ethnicities in the north, just swapping ethnicities to ensure that at the local level, if you resist Islam, you are also frustrated. However, people also resisted it. But that was the process they used from 1950 till after the Nigerian Civil War in 1970. Even after 1970, it also continued. Because after the Nigerian Civil War, the Igbo who had fought the war against the federal government were displaced. I'll also come to that in explaining, the patterns of conversion to Islam by the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria, particularly those of, at the border areas of the north. Now, after the Civil War, the powers were also held by the north. So most people who came from the south, for political opportunities, began to secretly convert to ensure that they retained, the opportunities at the national government. Now, coming to the southeast, that is, coming to this zone, look at the border here, look at the Igbo area here, look at the north central, Idoma, Egala, up to the central and northern part of Nigeria. The Igbo had prior to colonial rule, they were never conquered by any ethnicity or any other local power in Nigeria. They remained independent and had institutions that were really autonomous to the ideals of the people. After the Nigerian Civil War, as a result of losing everything they had labored over the years to acquire in Nigeria to the victorious federal army, a lot of people became frustrated, particularly when an economic policy was introduced by the new government, that balkanized the Igbo and removed the Igbo from every political and economic, spaces of the national government. First was that they introduced the banking, mechanism that ensured that no matter whatever you had saved within the 30-month period of the Civil War, from 67 to 70, whether in the Biafran currency or in the national currency of Nigeria, because there was also some kind of secret trading going on within the border areas of Nigeria during the war, that the national government approved the refund of only £20. So by 1970, when the war was over, an average Igbo family could only have £20 of the national government currency. So you could not survive without submitting whole and entire to a regime that is oppressive. Most northern Igbo northern Igbo land groups, in Soka, Ibagwaka, Ibagwane, Obolafo, and Enuwezi, down to Afiba, Bakleke, the communities border the central part of Nigeria and then had access to the north. Conversion rate began, at a very high speed to Islam. So it was as a result of the frustration, post-war frustrations, in the region that first of all, orchestrated, the idea of conversion. Though there had been one or two cases of conversion in the 40s and 50s, but of a very negligible proportion to Islam. But the post-war conversions to Islam in this part of Nigeria arose as a result of, interest to survive, as a result of economic considerations, as a result of political considerations, and all that. So that's what triggered, hyped conversion in the post-war order of Nigeria. And up to today, those who converted, you can't define them as true Muslims, because they practice their traditional rites, traditional religions, and all that in the secret. So they will only tell you when you interact with them that Islam is a way, since Islam is a way of life, that a way of life is any way you apply and you survive. That they themselves are using Islam to get contract, negotiate status, interact with big men and the emirs in the north, who give them mining leases and all that. So Islam, conversion to Islam by some of these folks, was as a result of, their interest in economic survival, not interest in spiritual revival and growth. So, I have to stop here and wish that by the time the research is finished, it will be an interesting publication. Thank you.
And our respondent, Dr. Ayelet Harel-Shalev, here from the University of Ben-Gurion, is a senior lecturer at the Conflict Management and Resolution Program and the Department of Politics and Government. Dr. Harel-Shalev is the author of The Challenge of Democracy, Citizenship, Rights and Ethnic Conflicts in India and Israel, that came out in 2013 with Cambridge University Press and Foundation Books, India. Her academic interests include deeply divided societies, feminist IR, women competence, ethnic conflicts and democracy, minority rights and religion, gender and politics. Her recent publications include Bringing Women's Voices Back In, Conducting Narrative Analysis in IR, which came out in the International Studies Review in 2016, co-authored with Shir Daphna Tkoa, and another article, Gendering Conflict Analysis, the Case of Minority Women and Muslim Women's Status in India, in the journal, I suppose, Ethnic and Racial Studies from 2017. And Dr. Harel-Shalev will respond.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you very much for the detailed introduction. And thank you very much to the conference organizers and for two illuminating talks. We miss Professor Jenkins. She was supposed to talk about India, even more diverse in terms of regions. So I'll be brief, but I have some comments both in general and related to each of the talks. We heard two illuminating talks and papers that deal with the hybrid religious nature of a multi-faith state or converting city, and both talks also relate to the nature of sovereignty and how the sovereign grasps the issue of conversion as a threat or as a symbol of power, conversion of architecture and conversion of people. Like sacred time and sacred text, as Uriel writes, sacred space is a basic component of the structure of religions, and as such is part of a process of conversion. Like the conversion of communities, conversion of space is often caused by cultural interplay, by political change, and by power and military power, following conquest and invasions. Now, Dr. Bauer's paper aimed at asking whether it is necessary to modify the aesthetic fabric of a conquered Islamic city in order to convert it to become more Christian or Occidental, or is it possible for a city to remain Islamic in its urban and architectural style, yet to be Christian in some other respects? In his view, it is a question about the relation of the aesthetic and identity in multi-faith and interconnected societies. Now, Dr. Bauer beautifully presents how one tends to designate a conquest of a city with a date. And however, instead of telescoping a conquest into military events or particular battle or warfare, it might be better to think of it as an unfolding process that continuously shapes and negotiates group identities, and with them the memories and beliefs. In this particular case, the conquest, its construction and aftermath affect attitude toward Islamic heritage in the Middle Ages to the present day. In Doron's view, the conversion of a city is an open-ended process, as he wrote, that might be accelerated or reversed in that sense. And in addition, we learn how architecture is very much political. What was interesting to see is the evolvement of cultural practices along with the change of architecture. The ceremonies and the process of cleaning and purity of the monuments and the aesthetic conversion is no less important than the transformation of the buildings themselves. Doron writes that regardless of physical transformation that caused the conversion of a city, its association or disassociation with foreign past is largely a matter of perception and imaginary constructions. Now, as you're probably aware, we all have our own associations about research, and my curiosity is related to my own research regarding your research. And I thought about it in terms of what you mentioned at the end of the paper and the end of your talk, and whether there are in these regions in practice some ambivalent treatment toward the Islamic sites, what you termed as the fluidity. Let's say, if I'll give the example of present-day India, for instance, we can see the example, for instance, of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya that was demolished by the Hindus. And on the other hand, we have the beautiful, magnificent Taj Mahal, which became a part of the narrative of the state. So I was wondering, in that sense, although the main narrative, for instance, in society in India, that it is suffering from foreign cruel rulers and conquest, at the same time they acknowledge sometimes the beauty and miraculous nature of the buildings such as the Taj Mahal. So it would be interesting for me to hear about some incidents in your region that you're studying about this fluidity. When do these societies destroy the monuments, and when they keep it? Is it political? Do we have some, what are the interests there? So that was interesting for me to see. Now, Dr. Chimee's paper relates to multi-faith Nigeria and the trial of Muslim forces within Nigeria to encourage, or perhaps force, conversion to Islam, not merely by force, but also by charismatic leadership at first, but then by inducement such as scholarship and jobs, sometimes preventing jobs for those who are not converting to Islam. Now, in a situation of insecurity and social insecurity, religious conversion might seem a reasonable choice. Now, Dr. Chimee presented that substantial part of the community decided to convert from various reasons, including academic status, social status, security-wise, and elsewhere. Sometimes they convert and they're Christian at night and Muslim during the day. And it is very, very interesting for me, and the paper left me with the question of what does the state has to say in that matter? I mean, you talked about the policy of the leaders, but what is interesting to me is it a law, a written law? We see now Nigeria as a federal state with the rule of law, so I was wondering whether this tendency was merely a policy of leaders, or is it written for all? This is one thing. Now, it's really interesting to see that as colonialism unraveled, the regional government was created for the three regions into which Nigeria was divided in 1946, and the emergent leadership in the north began to use this economic empowerment and political appointment privileges to Muslims and to treat non-Muslims otherwise. And for me, it is very interesting to see whether there are some counter reactions to this, let's say, conversion by force to Islam. Because as I realized basically I asked, what is the response of local Christians, or maybe the response of the church? Because I think if I understand correctly, the church had different status in different regions in Nigeria, so I was wondering what is reaction of the church to these moves. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps you would like first to respond to this response.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ayelet. I appreciate your comments. Now, very quick response to the two issues you pointed out. That is whether the Christian body, first, whether the policy of organization was theoretically, practically a policy of government, or possibly where there was also a national government, whether it could have been just a practice. Very quickly, it was a policy of the regional government of the northern region. Because, like I told you, by 1946, Nigeria, was divided into 3 regions by the British. And it was as a result of pressure from the nationalists to become part of the everyday activity, political activity in the country, that they needed some say, and they pressured on till the colonial secretary eventually acceded to, their request of regionalizing politics, according to the regions. And then it was the regionalization of politics that guaranteed regional assemblies with full powers of making laws and implementing laws. So in the 3 regions, the northern region, the southwestern region, and the eastern region, parliaments were functioning, absolutely functioning to, make laws, so long as they do not conflict with the national law, the national parliament in Lagos. So the northern region developed this policy, as a regional policy to ensure that the south does not, do not, continue to dominate the political and economic spaces in the north. Because by the time the British conquered Nigeria, and between 1914, when Nigeria was created, as a political entity, and 1946, very few northerners had Western education. But Christianity had come to the south way back in 1860. So by 1900, a lot of southerners were speaking English and all that. So they were employed by the colonial, administration to work in the north, where northerners were not available to fill the spaces. So that was how the south showed up in the administrative, circles of the north. So it was a regional policy documented in the national regional debates, in the regional parliamentary debates that are found in the National Archives of Nigeria. It wasn't a policy, couched or hashed by the political leaders. Then, secondly, you ask whether the Christians, the Christian leadership, did anything in response to this kind of. They did not do anything. Practically, they did not, because one was that Christian proselytization, the details are in the paper, but there was no way I could also bearing the time limit attached to the paper presentation. The British, after 1901, 1902, when the Sultanate collapsed, they removed the Sultan, appointed another Sultan that was going to be very, very serviceable to the British interest. In one of the meetings, the British colonial administrator that established Nigeria on Lugard held with the emirs and the new Sultan of Sokoto. In that meeting, the northern leadership, the emirs and the Sultan appealed to the British to help preserve
their Islamic values, Islamic culture, and Islamic traditions by ensuring that Southerners are kept away from, proselytizing Christianity in the north. Very quickly, the British acceded to that request and barred Christian missionary activities in the north. Prior to that time, the activities across the Niger up to Lokoja, other maps I had would have shown the movement of the Christian proselytization movement. So the British stopped them quickly and gave a directive that for you to preach or to set up school in the north or to talk about Christianity in the north, that you have to get a written approval from the emir of that particular state you want to operate in. And you know what will happen? The emirs will decline it. In fact, in one instance, the emir of Kano had to turn back Reverend Topwell, who had appeared, through the River Niger area to Kano to preach. He gave him 2 days to wind up and leave the north. And the British were there. They did not do anything. This was a foreign European missionary. Ordinarily, if the British wanted to protect the interests of the Christians, they would have also encouraged proselytization. And secondly, too, to ensure that Christianity also is restricted, the British introduced the idea of what they call visitors' quarters at the inside of the northerners. The idea of a sabongari, what they call sabongari, strangers' quarters, that you are kept at the marginal space of the society where you live. You don't go beyond there to come into the central areas where the native people live and operate and do their own business. You have your own market in the sabongari. If they need anything from you, they will come to the sabongari, your waters, and you don't come over to their own waters because you're not a Muslim. So the policies were there and supported by the British. So the Christian missionaries were handicapped in responding to this kind of original challenge because, it affected them very adversely and they could do nothing about that. I think thank you so much.
Okay, Ayelet, I think I perfectly agree with you that there is a fluidity and it's kind of fascinating why certain monuments are being preserved. It's also true for objects, by the way, and why others not. In the case of architecture, I think buildings are either preserved or demolished if they interfere with certain kind of group narratives. Not always the dominating group, by the way, because there can be kind of an element subversive sabotage of building at the same time. But people are practical and pragmatic. Buildings are very expensive, and so they're looking for ways to kind of convert them without damaging them, like symbolically. And one way to do that is simply to point to the fact that this building attests to, symbolically, to a victory, to the fact that we conquered another culture. This is a very kind of common narrative. Now, I think I gave several examples of this fluidity, and it's, I'm fascinated by the examples in India as well, but what really is kind of troubling me is to see that to what extent still Islamic heritage is being destroyed in Palma De Majorca in the 20th century. There is as much destruction of Islamic heritage in the 20th century, if not more, than even immediately after the conquest. So there are kind of mysterious fires in basement where artifacts are being preserved, and this always damages kind of Islamic remains, never Gothic altarpieces. This is the rule. And the last incident was in 2007. There was kind of two beautiful, they were not really Islamic, but they were Islamicate wooden ceilings in basement. This is 2007, it's not recent. Everybody knows how to preserve things. Suddenly there's a fire, there's no more ceilings. On the other hand, when you look at the mainland, especially Andalusia, in places like Seville, there's a lot of excavations, there's a lot of kind of attempts to actually emphasize the Islamic heritage. And this is also because it serves two things. One is tourism, right? It's just very pragmatic. And the other is a certain kind of narrative, I think, of New Europe, and I'm not trying to be here judgmental or critical, that tries to show that the multicultural kind of model works. So it just really fluid based on what kind of, people, yes. So, but people can be also very pragmatic. We have to remember that.
open the floor for questions. Lisa?
Yeah, I have a question for Doron. Beautiful paper and beautiful slides also. And one thing I was curious about is you did such a good job of laying out these kind of different logics and how they result in different amounts of adaptation or not. So the cleaning one, for instance, you just sort of like take off the surface and the essential piece remains the same, versus if you're actually concerned about the geometry, then there are more fundamental changes. Do you have any instances of explicit arguments between different models for evaluating the same piece of architecture?
Well, less so in the Middle Ages, because we don't have debates whether to preserve the monument or not. But later on we do. So, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century, the gate that I showed of Palma De Majorca, this is an Islamic gate, or at least it was believed to be Islamic. It was, of course, modified to a certain extent afterwards, but there were very interesting debates that was published in newspaper in the period about whether to preserve it or not. And the argumentation is really fascinating because, one people say that, actually the people that wants to destroy it say it's not Islamic. They try to prove that it's actually not Islamic, but they are the really Christian Catholic people. So, I mean, and then you have the other people, the antiquarian, that argue for the fact that it is Islamic, and everything is kind of shifting very, very quickly from a declaration of a national monument. This is a big thing and plans to do like a square around it and a park, to simply people coming there and putting dynamite and just blowing the thing away.
But just to push on that a little bit, you don't have early modern or medieval examples of deliberation about whether to preserve or not.
Well, there's, the famous case of the great Mosque of Cordova, with a lot of kind of folklore that surrounds it, whether Charles did say what he said or not. I think this kind of discussion becomes, there's a discourse from the end of the 15th century onwards. So there's a recent book by Bierto, he's a professor at the UNED in Madrid, that tries to explore attitudes of humanists in 16th century Spain towards Islamic heritage. And I think this is a great reference. They feel ambivalent towards this monument. On the one side, they are fascinated by the aesthetics and other factors. They are scholars, right? But they try to kind of incorporate them into certain kind of, I wouldn't say national, but maybe proto-national narratives. So this would be my reference, but it's a very big topic.
Nimrod?
So basically, I'd like to follow up on the questions, actually to both of you. Doron, the issue of the different narratives today in the 20th century, you mentioned just a critical narrative about the Mudechar art and about other influences of Islam on Spanish civilization. If you can elaborate a little more on that and just kind of give an overall picture of it. General lines.
This is a topic for a seminar. It's interesting that you mentioned the word Mudechar, because even the word Mudechar is a modern construction. So this is an invention that tries to see, in the 19th century, I don't know if you're familiar with Spanish nationalism or a way to move away from nationalism, but there are two kind of very, very famous scholars, Castro and Sanchez Albornoz, that I mentioned before, that try to kind of shape the identity of the emerging Spanish society that never existed in its national form before. So one argues, as I mentioned before, that there's very little influence of Islam and Judaism on Spanish culture, that it remains to a large extent Gothic even, going back to the past. And the other one, Castro says, we had some sort of coexistence, and this is what makes us Spanish. The fact that we actually incorporated a lot from other people. And I think the term Mudechar, as a modern construct, because it's not really a medieval term, is a way to kind of support Castro's argument, to show that Spanish society is actually open to influences. Now, when it comes to the term itself, there's a lot of critique about the term recently, because it's very easy to deconstruct it and to show that the Mudechar, as we understand it, actually does not exist. In the sense that people do not really understand even Islamic architecture in the Middle Ages the way that we see it. It's not really always symbolic to them in the way that it is symbolic to us. And many times, you know, this is a new theory of mine, that actually the Mudechar, one of the major kind of periods of Mudechar is when in Pedro the First in Castile in 3050, he begins to build several palaces in a kind of Islamic style that people really like to call Mudechar. My theory is that there's only economical motivation there, in the sense that this is immediately after the Black Death. There's a very shortage of workforce. There's inflation of prices. So he simply imports people from the south that will build his palaces. He doesn't care that much about the symbolism of what he sees. And this is very characteristic of at least many cases in the Middle Ages. I'm not saying that, you know, in other cases, as I showed before, architecture serves as an icon. So
you include the Alcazar in the Seville?
The Alcazar of Seville was modified by Pedro. Yes.
Yeah, I know. So you included in this.
It's a secret. Yeah. Don't tell anyone. But I think it's the motivation there. I mean, people want to see it as a symbolic act. You know, Pedro comes and he's the king that is affiliated with the Muslims, and, you know, contrary to his brother Enrique, who associated himself with the North. But there's when a king go and build palaces, there's a very important economical consideration, and this is one of the problems in art history nowadays, that we completely moved away from, you know, Marxist explanation of art, and we are solely focused on the symbolic. Now, if you examine what happened to salaries of craftsmen immediately after this is a period after the Black Death. It's a major event, if not the most important event in the High Middle Ages, and it changes completely the economical infrastructure and structure. And for example, you know, I wrote recently a paper about painters. I mean, they were paid. I mean, the prices of free tables rose 10 times higher after the Black Death. Just as an example. So I think rushing into giving this kind of buildings of Pedro I a symbolical explanation without considering the economical motivations for the buildings would be faulty at best.
Okay, and speaking of economics, I think we should be economical about our responses, because there's a good lineup of questions.
Okay.
So there's a follow-up there from Uriel. Yeah?
Yeah, the question to Ihediwa, you mentioned the pressure that the Muslims are placing on the Christians, and I'm wondering, and sort of follows up on what Ayelet has mentioned, is there any difference of opinions, not on the Christian side, but on the Muslim side? Are the Muslims all aligned and consensual about oppressing the Christians, or is there any kind of internal discussion and disagreements about the kind of policies they need to apply towards the Christians?
Yeah. The Muslims, of course, were the beneficiaries of the policy, regardless of how it impacted on any other person that is not a Muslim. It wasn't their concern, because in one of the parliamentary debates, which I read, you know, the parliament was also composed of people from the minority areas, but they were minorities, and their vote would not count in, when policies are approved. It has to be, through voting, and they'll be voted out. So when they raised such opposition, a couple of oppositions were raised from the minority groups in the north, who were also part of the parliament, particularly from the Tiv area in central Nigeria. The Tiv, have been very formidable in opposing Islam, and that accounted for why, even till today, they are on the receiving end of the violence of Islam in Nigeria. Even as we speak, their communal wars are going on against the Tiv, engendered by the Fulani hegemons, who are the ruling class in the north. So it was like, no Fulani or no Muslim condemned the policy. They were all in agreement with the implementation of the northernizing policy.
Sir? Yeah. It's a question for Doron. Again, I was intrigued by your use of architecture, especially in evaluating the conversion from evaluating the architecture from one context to another. So I'm not going to make any kind of nationalistic or thing. I'm just trying to think in a philosophical way. Thinking about one very striking kind of conversion of an edifice from a context to another, which is, for instance, the cortex, or the edification of a mosque. Besides on the political machine, which renovated the place or holy space after many centuries of destruction. So starting from that, and now would you take the courage to extend this very nice piece of property you delivered today to modern times? Again, to see if it's possible to use this kind of readings and analysis to the present context, especially a kind of theoretical answer, not political answer, but theoretical answer to those, for instance, to the third temple, and in my own case, more just make a new room for the old temple. You understand what I'm trying to say? So if you can just drive this kind of model into a deconstructive, more radical deconstructive perception of space.
Definitely yes. I'm actually currently gathering the courage to do that because, I mean, one of the main barriers is the fact that I'm a medievalist and I'm expected to write on the Middle Ages. But actually, I recently decided I'm going to a fellowship next year, 1 year. So to kind of move away actually from Spain and explore conquer cities from in the coast of North Africa up to the Middle East, including Tel Aviv. Now, this is not exactly a conquest. Again, I don't want to be too much political, but definitely there's kind of a foreign element that come to a certain territory and try, in terms of the urbanism itself, to transform space. So my book is going to start with Ceuta in the 15th century and then moves through Tunisia up to Tel Aviv, the relationship between Tel Aviv and Jaffa. So this is my plan right now. So yes, I think it can be applied to present context.
Okay, what we're going to do now, I have already 5 people lined up for questions there. I'm going to ask you all to present your questions and we can gather them and so we can respond. Maybe some of them will overlap. Nadia, but please make your questions as short as possible.
Oh, it is more of a remark than a question, but you mentioned the historiography of the humanists in the Renaissance, and I would like to mention also the case of Sicily, which had a Muslim past. And although in the Middle Ages there was much awareness of this Muslim past and the conquest by the Romans and so on, by the 15th and 16th centuries, you see humanists trying to eliminate the Muslim past. For instance, when they discover an inscription which was clearly in Arabic, they attribute it to a Chaldean past. They say it's kind of Aramaic, a strange Aramaic. Maybe attribute it even to Jews, but don't mention Muslims at all. Now, an important historian, he was a Dominican, he wrote the history of Sicily, and also he put the stress on the Greek history of Sicily, Roman times, with almost eliminating the Muslim part. And some of the Spanish humanists or Sicilians who wrote about Spanish history did more or less the same, from the same motivations to enhance the classical past, the classical roots, or in the case of Spain, also the Gothic roots, and as I said, minimize the Islamic presence.
Thank you. Inba?
Yes, that's also to Doron. Can you say a bit about the relationship between architecture and the conversion of architecture and material culture, daily objects, and their conversion or
Yes, also to you. According to Barbara Fuchs Maurophilia, Spanish monarchs, they not only constructed, but they also decorated their spaces with Morisque style. How do you explain your thesis there?
Okay, and
in order in early Christian Rome,
the temples of the fallen man have been converted to churches long after they have been fallen in disuse. And so there the conversion of the temples was more a kind of re-evaluation of new to evaluate what to give again this lost area and new value, economic value as well. And I think to your example of Ceuta with the plaza, which has been raised in front of the mosque, can it also be a kind of other function which we can consider in the conversion from mosque to church, also to add this economical aspect to give maybe a certain place in the city again a certain kind of economical value?
Okay. Are you able to absorb one last question? Over there?
Yeah, it's a question for Ihediwa. Are these converted Muslims second-class Muslims? Could you say that they're the businessmen who convert, and is it even worthwhile to convert if you're going to be considered second-class? How is this this opportunistic conversion accepted or not accepted?
Okay, so please.
Okay. So I'll try to do it quickly. So first of all, in Bar, I think I mentioned it briefly, but I wrote an article about this with Elena Porino, which I mentioned. So when you go nowadays in Palma, what you see is basically Gothic architecture. I mean, the main monuments are in the Gothic style, and very much Gothic more than in other places. I mean, in terms of its being rational and very geometrical, almost as opposing this kind of exuberance of Islamic style that we associate. Now, when we looked at domestic inventories in the archives, we found that actually these kind of spaces were filled by Islamic objects. So you have a lot of merchants operating in Palma. It's a port city. They go to Alexandria and they go to, of course, to North Africa, and they bring with them a lot of objects from elsewhere. You have also an important community of Jews. So what I mentioned before is kind of an interesting juxtaposition between official public architecture and interior of places, which is, I mean, if you go nowadays, it's a little bit misleading to look at the buildings just from the outside.
So can I just direct it more specifically?
No, actually, because there's more questions to address. Do you want to address the other questions?
Yes, so Dov, and the term Morisco is problematic in itself. It derives from modern scholarship, and it does
Maurophilia, the book Maurophilia, not Morisco, Maurophilia. The thesis, Barbara Fuchs' thesis.
Yes, I think I will, at least in contemporary research, it's highly debated whether these terms are relevant to the Middle Ages. What we see today as clearly an Islamic motif was not necessarily perceived as such in the Middle Ages. So we have to be very, very careful about this. It's not that there's a dichotomy between cultures in Spain. It's a different model. It's not Islam against Christian, as the narrative would like to see it. And it's not also coexistence in the way that we imagine it. It's something much more dynamic and complicated. So I'm just saying that there's a problem with the analytical terms that I would love to explore further about it. Yes, definitely. I focus more on symbolical dimensions, but you're totally right. I mean, the attempt to regularize the city is both symbolically, it also serves practical concerns like safety. I mean, it just makes everything wider and bigger, but of course also economical. This is the model that the Portuguese know. But the interesting thing is that they reject the urbanism of Islam for various reasons, including this one. So I agree.
Yeah, in response to your question, in the north, the converts were not, there was no discrimination, with respect to their status as new converts, to Islam, but down towards the Middle Belt, converts who voluntarily, who were converted, post, Islamic period, were looked at, with serious suspicion, because the Fulanis or the Hausas know that traditional practices of the people are still observed alongside, side by side, Islamic practices. So they call them pseudo-Muslims. But for the Igbo converts, from the onset, they know that it's a dubious conversion, that the purpose of that conversion is very clear. So they do not take them to heart as true Muslims. Just like Yoruba Muslims in the north, they look at them as fake Muslims because they drink alcohol, they eat pigs, they eat the animals that are prohibited in Islam. So, and their ritual practices of Orisha cult and all that, the Muslims also go there. So
do that, observe those practices. So Southern Muslims are overall seen as diluted Muslims, by the core, Hausa Fulani, Muslims in Nigeria. Yeah.
Okay, please join me with thanking the speakers once again for this wonderful session.